Why don't you lay out your thesis, your proposal for how this mediation can happen? We see there's a serious shift here. I mean, Macron with Biden at the White House, it was the first state visit to the White House under the Biden administration of any world leader. And clearly this was a major subject of their talks, both Macron being a back channel to Putin, but also then President Biden himself saying he would speak with Putin. What do you think needs to happen?
I think both sides see that there is no military way out. I'm speaking of NATO and Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other side. This war, like von Clausewitz told us 2 centuries ago, is politics by other means or with other means, meaning that there are political issues at stake here, and those are what need to be negotiated. What President Macron said is absolutely correct, that President Putin wants political outcomes that, in my view, absolutely can be met at the negotiating table. Just to quote what Macron said in another interview, he said, "One of the essential points we must address, meaning we, the West, as President Putin has always said, is the fear that NATO comes right up to its doors and the deployment of weapons that could threaten Russia. Much of this war has been about NATO enlargement from the beginning. And in fact, since NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia were put on the table by President George W. Bush Jr. and then carried forward by the U.S. neocons basically for the next 14 years, this issue has been central, and it's been raised as central. But President Biden, at the end of 2021, refused to negotiate over the NATO issue, but now is the time to negotiate over the NATO issue. That's the geopolitics at stake. There are other issues as well, but the point is this war needs to end because it's a disaster for everybody, a threat to the whole world. According to European Union President Ursula von der Leyen last week, 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died, 20,000 civilians, and the war continues. And so this is an utter disaster, and we have not searched for the political solution. What's interesting, Amy, and I would emphasize it, is that inside the U.S., we're finally hearing about this. President Biden's statement was very consequential, but the week before that, perhaps as notable, was the statement of the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who said, now is the time to negotiate. What we see is a big debate inside the administration between the neocons on the one side, and I would say those who see reality on the other side. Victoria Nuland, probably our neocon in chief in the administration, who's been part of this NATO enlargement from the start, said, no, can't negotiate. But others are saying, you know, it's really time. So this is a debate within the U.S. as much as it is a question of sitting down between the United States and Russia.
Sachs, you've mentioned that there are 4 core issues that you believe need to be negotiated. You've written about these, not only the issue, obviously, of NATO enlargement, but also the issue of protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and also the fate of Crimea and the future of the Donbas. Could you talk a little bit about those other issues, especially the fate of Crimea, because most Americans and the media in this country do not really cover the historic relationship of Crimea to Russia and its military importance to Russia.
Yeah, Juan, thank you very much. From the beginning, from before the beginning, from 2021, when Putin made clear what the political issues at stake were, but I happen to know this goes back in many ways back to 1990, 91. I was at that point an advisor to the economic team of President Gorbachev, and then later President Yeltsin and Ukrainian President Kuchma. So I've watched this from the start. There have been a few very important political issues at stake. One is the NATO enlargement. I think it is really the dominant issue, but three others are extremely important. Of course, I should say equally important is Ukraine's sovereignty as a sovereign country and in need of security arrangements. But NATO as Ukraine's security doesn't work. It's an explosive brew. So one needs to find, as President Zelensky himself said earlier this year before backing off from it, that there needed to be a non-NATO way to secure Ukraine, and there can be. So that's another crucial issue, is Ukraine's sovereignty and security in a non-NATO manner. The third issue that is very consequential is Crimea. Crimea, the peninsula, people can look on the map, the peninsula and the Black Sea, has been the home to Russia's naval fleet in the Black Sea, and therefore completely consequential for Russia's economic and foreign policy and military security since 1783. So this is, from Russia's point of view, an absolutely core issue. And incidentally, in 2008, when George W. Bush Jr. was very unwisely pushing NATO enlargement, President Putin said specifically to President Bush in Bucharest at the time of the NATO-Russia meeting that if you push NATO enlargement, we retake Crimea. This was already explicit. And the point is that for Russia, this is vital. Now, after what happened, of course, in 1954, in a symbolic action, because there was a Soviet Union at the time, not separate nations, Nikita Khrushchev, the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the chairman of the Soviet Union, transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. It didn't mean much. It was a celebration, a 300th anniversary of a treaty that Khrushchev celebrated by this administrative transfer. It became consequential after the end of the Soviet Union and the independence of Russia and Ukraine. There was a delicate balancing act for many, many years, especially in the early 2010s. Then President Viktor Yanukovych was negotiating with Russia to give essentially a long-term lease to Crimea to satisfy Russia's security desires and needs as a balancing, as a delicate balancing. But the United States very unwisely and very provocatively contributed to the overthrow of Mr. Yanukovych in early 2014, setting in motion the tragedy before our eyes. And that ended that delicate balance. Russia said, Crimea has to be ours because we just saw that we can't depend on a long-term arrangement with Ukraine. The United States contributed to the overthrow of a Ukrainian president who was negotiating with us over this core issue. So my view is that, and almost everybody that discusses this in private understands, Crimea has been historically and will be in the future effectively, at least de facto, Russian. And this cannot be the cause of World War III. We have to understand the centrality of this. We have been told about the centrality of this basically explicitly since 2008. The last issue on the table is a real issue, and that is the ethnic divisions within Ukraine itself, given the complex history of this region and the piecing together of all of the countries of this region from various times in history. Ukraine itself is ethnically divided. On the western part, it's ethnically Ukrainian, but complicated there too. But on the east, which is the Donbas, Lugansk and Donetsk, the two regions that are the center of this war, these are predominantly Russian, ethnic Russian, Russian-speaking, Russian Orthodox, and after Yanukovych's overthrow, the place where paramilitaries demanded independence of these regions or joining Russia, and Russia supported those paramilitaries, and autonomous or independent states were declared. What happened, and this is crucial to understand, is that in 2015, there were agreements to solve this problem by giving autonomy to these eastern regions that were predominantly ethnic Russian. And these are called the Minsk Agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. And in particular for Minsk II, the Europeans, especially France and Germany, said, we will be guarantors of that. But then Ukraine, under the post-Yanukovych regime, two presidencies, Poroshenko and Zelensky, refused to implement the Minsk II agreement, saying they're dead. We don't accept them. We don't accept autonomy. Russia said, well, you had a diplomatic agreement, and now this is violated, and this became another cause of this war. And we need a resolution of the Donbas issue as well. Ukrainian sovereignty, no NATO enlargement, de facto Russian control over Crimea, some kind of solution like Minsk II, some kind of autonomy, some solution for the Donbas. These are the four pieces that can save Ukraine, spare Russia, save the world from what is a growing disaster. And this is why we need a pragmatic approach.